12 of us.
Need 4 members if y'all see somebody out in the hall. Is it 16?
12, 13.
13. $14. 14's quorum. They count Thompson.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We got 14.
14?
Yeah.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll call the committee meeting to order. I appreciate very much the members attending. I know it's been a long day, but these are important bills, and we want to give them every consideration. If you're in the room and you wanted to sign up to speak, we have a sign-up sheet up front. We're going to call House Bill 1178, Representative Dixon. Come on up and present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I bring to you House Bill 1178, which deals with when we bring a bill to the education committees, both in the House and the Senate. Over the last few years, we have made a few mistakes because we haven't really had a good picture of what the future cost of something was going to be. If you think back to National Board Certified Teachers, some of the problems we've had with a math and science incentive that we did for teachers. There have been several of those that it sounded like a real good idea, but then when 4 or 5 years went by and the number of people who were involved became much greater, it became too expensive. What 1178 does is simply require that when we have a physical note for these types of bills, that the audit department or whoever is preparing the physical note must prepare a best guess estimate of what the impact is as much as 10 years out, so that we can look at an anticipated cost beyond the first year or two, and hopefully that will help us not pass something and then 2 or 3 years later have to jerk it back out, which gives us as a legislature a black eye. I would be ready to answer any questions that you have, and would appreciate your support of this change.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there questions on House Bill 1178 of Representative Dixon? All right, Madam Secretary, has anybody signed up to speak on 1178? Okay. All right, what's the pleasure of the committee on House Bill 1178? Have a motion by Senator Mellis to pass. Have a second. I'm sorry? Second, okay. I said objection. Have a motion and a second. Any other discussion on, we're discussing House Bill 1178 by Representative Dixon. Any other discussion? All in favor of passage as presented, please raise your hand. All right, and all opposed? I do not see any nay votes. 1178 passes as presented. Thank you, Representative Dixon. We'll call House Bill 824, Representative Dudgeon from the 24th over in the House, Representative Dudgeon, and there is a subcommittee report in your folder as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, today I bring to you House Bill 824. This is the result of the work of the State Education and Finance Committee, subcommittee also chaired by Chairman England over the summer. Basically, what we're looking to do is to modernize and fix the equalization formula for education. In education, there's two. There's the regular funding, which is QB, which is per child, same all over Georgia. But in order to equalize for low wealth property tax districts, we've had an equalization grant for the past 25, 30 years. And unfortunately, now the formula is broken. For example, this fiscal year, the formula said that we were supposed to award almost $830 million for that formula, but the line item in the budget's only $436 million. And the formula is kind of ballooning to numbers that are completely unreasonable for the state to pay. So we wanted to look at the formula and look at it. There's another problem with the formula too, is that it's starting to divert more money to wealthier counties. The way the current formula is written, is it ranks the school systems in property tax wealth from 1 to the bottom, picks the bottom 75% of that list, so 75% of the counties get a grant. And what that has happened now is more bigger counties are moving into that top tier there, that the original purpose of this grant was to give it to the really low wealth counties who have no way to raise a lot of money from property tax. And we are now seeing a lot of the money going to some metro counties, and it's really diverting the money away from the systems who need it. The other problem too is because of formula, by generating a formula earnings in the code of $830 million and the appropriations only $436, we have to prorate it across the board, which means that the poorest counties are getting the same 50% haircut as the wealthiest counties are getting the same 50% haircut. So again, last summer, this was studied very in depth by the Finance Study Commission, looked at multiple ways to achieve a better formula. The recommendation is basically to, instead of funding to the 75th percentile, we want to take the statewide average of property tax wealth, and we throw the bottom 5% of schools and top 5% of schools out to make it better statistics. We're going to pick that average number, and then we're going to fund to that. There are some winners and losers in this bill, but it's important to know that there are winners and losers every year in equalization. Every year they re-rank these schools. Some people get more money, some get low, and the local boards have a hard time budgeting because from year to year it's kind of like going to the Vegas to say how much money you're going to win with equalization. One advantage of the new formula is it's much more stable, and if you look at it, it tends to have more predictable results, be easier for our local school systems to deal with. I want to say it doesn't change anything. Equalization, basically, the basic formula says for every mill over 5 that a low wealth system assesses, they get some matching money from the state. So they're incentivized already, and we're not changing that, to raise their property tax because we want them to fund as much local funds as possible without putting burden on the state. And in that theme, in subcommittee, Senator Rogers has an amendment which has now been accepted to raise the minimum millage required to participate. The original bill said you had to have 12 mills of local property tax to participate in this program. The amendment and the substitute, as you see before you, now says we're going to take that 12 mills and raise it to 14, 1/2 mill at a time over several years. Mr. Chairman, it's a long, complex bill, but at this point, I guess I would just ask if there are any questions.
We had a subcommittee report as well, and you have a sub in your
Yes.
folders, committee members. That sub is LC 334714S. Why don't we do this? Why don't we get Senator Grant to come up and discuss the change that was made in the subcommittee, and then you both can stay, and we'll entertain questions at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hill. The subcommittee that was appointed for HB 824 consisted of me as chairman, Senator Heath, Senator Hooks, Senator Rogers, and Senator Williams. And over about a 2-week period, we spent a lot of time working with the House and Senate budget offices and with the Education Funding Commission that had met all last summer and came up with some of these initial recommendations. I certainly appreciate the House sponsor in helping us to understand their process. We examined that. We looked at some of the options that they had entertained but later rejected. And we really feel like that this basically, the HB 824 does a good job of trying to correct some of the problems that currently exist with equalization. It does help improve the sustainability. The new formula is much more realistic in its application, where the current formula generates far more than the state can afford to pay. It's much more predictable in that that arbitrary 75th percentile benchmark is made a more stable statewide average. And then we think it does a very good job of meeting the original objective of equalization, which is provide those additional resources to school systems with that low property wealth relative to the student population. In a spirit of trying to, helping people who help themselves over a period of time, Senator Rogers had made a recommendation to move that base level of millage rate that a system had to levy from 12 mills to 14 mills, and that is phased in over a 4-year period, a half a mill a year. And so to be a qualifying system, you would have to start out in July of 2015 by raising at least 12 mills. And currently there's only one school system that does not meet, that qualifies for otherwise for equalization, that does not meet that, but they've got a 3-year time span in which to try to reach that goal, and then we raise that goal of 14 mills as a minimum for qualifying for equalization over the next 4 years. I'll be happy to entertain any questions, but we think this is a good solution to the equalization problem and makes it much more understandable for those school systems, particularly those that depend on this equalization for making sure that resources are available in their school districts to help educate the child.
Very good. I want to publicly thank Senator Grant and the members of that subcommittee who did spend a lot of time during a really busy time in the session, because this is a complex subject, and you had to first learn what we're doing now in order to understand what the proposal was and then evaluate that. And that's hard to do in a fast-paced session. I really appreciate y'all's efforts. And I think the other comment I would make, and Representative Dudgeon may have already made this comment, but I think our goal from here on, as our economy recovers and we hopefully start to generate new dollars, I think the goal of all of us is to put those funds back into QBE and to learn to operate the equalization with basically the funding we've got now, and not have it growing by leaps and bounds and start trying to pump back up our QBE formula. So this is a big step in that direction. There are a couple of questions, and we'll recognize, first of all, Senator Bullock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mike, come on back up if you will.
Well, I'd rather ask this to Senator Grant.
Okay.
What he did and the comments he was making. So be sure I'm understanding this, that we're going to begin with that a system that is not levying 12 mills of tax, then if they're below that, they don't qualify for any equalization grant.
12 mills of equivalent tax. There are some communities that do have a local option tax that goes towards maintenance operations, and that is figured in, so it's an equivalent millage rate. But that's correct. If they're not starting on July the 1st, 2015, if they're not levying at least 12 mills, then they would not be a qualified system and would not be eligible for equalization.
Further question?
Yes, sir.
So we're going to go then from 12 to 14 mills or equivalent in how many years?
Over a 4-year period.
4-year period. Now, this doesn't kick in until 2015? So
2015 is when it starts, so you've got 4 years on top of that 2015 time frame.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Hill.
Thank you, Chairman Hill. I have 2 questions. There was a reference that there are winners and loser counties, and you could tell me what counties, maybe just across North Atlanta, are the loser counties. And Jack,
I think there's a handout in your folder.
Yeah, I can tell you that most of the metro counties are not affected. Atlanta, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb do not receive this grant. Gwinnett and Cherokee are recent counties that are now starting to come into the formula. Cherokee didn't get any money 3 years ago, and they got a little bit, and then unchanged it would get several $1 million next year. And so Cherokee County is one of the metro counties, but most of the metro counties are not are neutral on this. I will say that if your county is a loser under this, your local board has, whether they want to understand or not, they actually have more property tax wealth per child available to them than the statewide average. So even though they may feel they're losers in this, they're still above average when you look at it across the whole state.
my follow-up question is, and I knew the answer as it related to Cobb especially. for instance, does Cobb County have to pay even more? Because right now they're paying $149 million.
It doesn't change at all any of the file mill local shares. Doesn't change any of the sort of money going into the system. And all we're changing is how we're allocating the money back out. Yeah.
Other questions? I see no further questions. What's the pleasure of the committee on the committee sub? Have a motion. I believe Senator Murphy, was that your motion? Senator Carter second. Pass out House Bill 824 by sub LC 334714S. Any further discussion? All in favor of passage, please raise your hand. Okay. And opposed, please raise your hand. Did not see a nay vote. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Senator Hill, could I just make one more remark? I'd like to especially thank Joy Feethy with the Senate Budget Office, because she did an enormous amount of work in digging through this and coming up with data and working with the House Budget Office. And if it weren't for her, I don't think we'd ever been able to wrap our arms around this.
Very good. Thank you very much. We'll now call up House Bill 811 by Representative Powell, and there is a committee sub in your folders. Hey, Representative Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring you House Bill 811. This bill, as it originally passed the House, was intended to deal with the problem that we have with redirected fees. There were 5 different fees that were addressed in the House version of this bill, and they were the Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, the Solid Waste Trust Fund, the Peace Officers Training Fund, the Indigent Defense Fund, and Joshua's Law. Now, since the date that it was adopted by the House also adopted a constitutional amendment, which is currently in the Senate, that would dedicate by Constitution the indigent defense. So we have taken out in the committee sub in front of you the indigent defense. So we're only left with Hazardous Waste Trust Fund, Solid Waste Trust Fund, Joshua's Law, and Peace Officers Training Fund. Now, as you're all aware, these funds are by law, not by Constitution, but by law, dedicated for a particular purpose. And in many of the years, we have not appropriated those funds for the intended purpose. And this bill is not intended to tie the legislature's hands as far as appropriation, because that can only be done by constitutional amendment. What it says is that if we do not appropriate the full amount that the fee raises, that the fee is then reduced to equal the amount of the appropriation, and it becomes a fee for service. For instance, if right now the Solid Waste Trust Fund, which is the tire fee, is $1 per tire, and that generates approximately $6 million a year. Currently, we are appropriating about $700,000. And what this bill would do is that if we appropriated in the legislature $3 million, say, for the Solid Waste Trust Fund, for tire recycling, for getting rid of tire dumps, those kinds of things, then the fee, because we're only appropriating half of what the fee generates, the fee would then be reduced from $1 to 50 cents. And so that happens in all of these fees. Now, what we've done to try to mitigate the effect on the budget is that we have phased it in over a 5-year period. And every year for the next 5 years, there would be a 20% increase in the appropriation amount. And if there is not, if this target appropriation amount is not met, then the fee is reduced by 20% until such point as we either reach 95% of the total amount that is generated, or until such time as the fee and the appropriation are equal to each other. Currently, there's probably about $46 million that is being generated by these fees that is not being appropriated for the intended purpose. So what we're talking about is an impact over the next 5 years of approximately somewhere between $8 and $10 million a year. And based on the fact that we're currently recovering from the recession, we can probably handle this out of growth rather than having to reduce some other appropriation. Now, the other thing that the sub does, which is not in the House version, in addition to removing indigent defense, the substitute version puts in a trigger and recognizes that in recent history we have found, much to our discomfort, that we are not immune from the vagaries of the economy. And it recognizes that if we get into a bad recession and the income of the state and the revenues of the state fall precipitously, that we should perhaps suspend this law if it were to be enacted so that we can redirect in times of fiscal crisis. Now, what the substitute does is it generates that at 7% of the revenue shortfall reserve. In other words, if a current appropriation is, say, $15 billion, and after taking out some things that are listed in the bill, and 7% of that is $1 billion, if the revenue shortfall reserve falls below $1 billion, then that would be considered an economic crisis, and therefore the actions of this law in requiring that these redirections stop would be suspended during that period of time. One of the things I would suggest to the committee is that we have only hit that amount of revenue shortfall reserve one time in the last 24 years. And that may be a little high on a percentage. That may be a more accurate percentage, might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5%, which would be somewhere between $600 and $800 million. But I would encourage you to give favorable consideration to the committee substitute, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, Mr.
I'm going to recognize the subcommittee who did the work and produced the committee sub was chaired by Senator Goggins, and I want to publicly thank Senator Goggins and Senator Balfour and Senator Bullock and Senator Mullis and Senator Sims for participating in that process. And I'm going to ask him to address his reasoning behind some of the changes that were made, and ask him to speak on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate Representative Powell for working with us. He came over and worked with us. We went to the governor's office and we worked with all parties involved. One of the concerns that we had was, since 2001, twice we built our reserve up to $1.5 billion twice, but during those times we've seen that those reserves depleted very quickly as we've hit some economic downturns. And we felt like that the bill as it stood, without any type of trigger mechanism, would really reduce the flexibility of us to be able to fund the necessary things that we need to in a crisis from a standpoint of education, health care, corrections, and so forth. So we thought that we came in at, we agreed at 7%, and that it just depends on what the prior revenues were. And we felt that was a good solution to the problem. And if it was above that, then yes, let's go ahead and fund that. But if it's below and we have an economic crisis, we do not want to tie our hands. We need the flexibility to be able to fund those necessary things. And so that's the reason we made the changes. The changes really, if you'll notice from the original to the sub, is on page 4 of the sub. And basically that change starts around line 128, and that's where we put the 7% language in. And as Representative Powell said, we did remove the Indigent Defense Fund, which is a constitutional amendment. And that's the changes, and that's the reason we went in that direction as a subcommittee. And say thank you to Senator Bullock and Senator Mullis and Senator Balfour.
Just interestingly, didn't you have some figures on the scrap tire fund? And we actually had been appropriating 80 to 90% of it up until the recession in 04 and 05, and then went back up to 4 million, 6 million, 6 million. This is out of a fee collected of 6 million or so. So we've actually been meeting that. We actually have a good record with that particular fund. There are a couple that we haven't, but there are other reasons maybe for that. But that particular fund, which everybody keeps bringing up, is actually, and I have as Casey Stengel said, you can look it up. We have the numbers here to prove it. But I'd be glad to show that to you, I mean, some of you in the press as well. But there is a public policy issue here, and we recognize that. But I will say this, Georgia has kept its AAA bond rating with good management of meeting crises and keeping maximum flexibility. And we think this is a good middle ground, but obviously the House will take another look at it when it goes back over. So we've got to cut some few questions, and there are three organizations signed up to speak on it. We're going to recognize. Let's go ahead and deal with our questions first, and then we'll ask those folks to come up and speak very quickly. I have Senator Hill as the first question.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. You referenced Joshua's Law, and many of us know Joshua's father, who's here in the Capitol today and yesterday. And can you give us a similar example? You gave us an example of how this would have an impact. Can you give us an example of the impact on Joshua's Law, if any, and is there concern that those funds may not be available? And it sounds like you may have addressed it, but
Currently, Joshua's Law raises somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million, give or take, and currently there's no appropriation for that. It has been appropriated to some extent in previous years, but current appropriation is basically zero. And so under the phase-in this, you take 20% of what the revenue from Joshua's Law is, which would be $2 million. And that would be the target amount in the first year of this phase-in. If we appropriated $2 million, then we would continue to raise the $10 million. If we did not appropriate $2 million, if we appropriated less than $2 million, then the amount of Joshua's Law would be reduced by 20%. So instead of generating $10 million, it would generate $8 million. And then the next year, if we met the target amount of $4 million, which would be an additional 20%, then it would go back to the $10 million. If we did not, then it would go down to $6 million till at some point in time the two would meet, or we would fully appropriate.
Senator Carter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Representative, thank you for this bill. Real quickly, help me to understand, and I wasn't on the subcommittee, so I haven't had a chance to really look at it. The super speeder fee that is supposed to go toward trauma, is that an example of this?
No, sir, it is not. What we did was we initially chose 5 funds, and now it's 4 funds. And the reason we did that were for a couple of reasons. Number one, we did not want to, while we're still trying to work out of the recession, we did not want to adversely impact the budget by loading up with 10 or 15 or 20 of these. The other thing is because this is a mechanism that has not been used before, quite frankly, we wanted to use this as a pilot project to make sure that we get whatever bugs may be in there. And this is like the 4th or 5th iteration of this bill, trying to address any kind of problems that people may see in the draft. But until we actually put it in effect and OPB generates the numbers and we look at the appropriation amount and the target appropriation amount and all of these formula numbers that are in here, we aren't absolutely sure that it'll work. And so, quite frankly, I only wanted to mess with 4 or 5 things rather than 20 things until we were sure that the system worked.
Can I have a follow-up real
Sure.
quickly?
Quickly, please.
Senator Goggins is gone.
That's one of our problems, and we're conflicting now with meetings that start at 1, so.
Very quickly, the 7% that if we don't meet that threshold and it's considered an economic crisis or whatever they described it as, does that mean that it goes to the reserve, or does it just go back into the general budget to be spent? I guess either way, it's the same thing.
Well, basically what we do is we do what we're doing now, which is we can redirect funds.
But it doesn't say specifically that it has to go into reserves.
No. I mean, right now, we are redirecting somewhere in the neighborhood of $46 million a year. And so if we do not reach the shortfall reserve target rate, then the bill would not go into effect, or if we had reached the shortfall target rate and it fell below that because we were in an economic crisis, then the effect of this would be suspended and there would not be any further reductions.
Senator Hooks.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Representative Powell, in the late 1980s, when I was the floor leader for Governor Harris, I sponsored the bill on the Solid Waste Trust Fund with a $1 fee for the tires. Quite frankly, it passed the House without a lot of changes, and what we ran into was the tires when we got to Senate. Senator Paul Brown was a tire dealer, and they all ganged up and so forth. All right, so we put the $1 charge on tires, but since '04, we've been giving 65% of that to the general fund of that tire charge. Is that right?
I don't have the exact numbers since that date, but I just know that right now we are probably only doing about 10%, 15% of the amount that is generated.
All right, but the charge was to clean up the piles of tires and dumps and stuff like that. At that time, we only had 2 scrap dealers, one in Atlanta and one in Macon, to take care of these things. Are you satisfied that we will have enough funds in the Solid Waste Trust Fund to take care of the tires with the committee substitute?
Under the committee substitute, if the target rate in the reserve fund is not met, then we can continue to redirect fees. If we don't appropriate, and we wouldn't be required to appropriate, then we may stay at the $700,000 level, because right now we're at $300 and something million, and this bill will not even go into effect till we've got approximately $1.1 billion in the reserve fund. And the bill is drafted to go into effect in fiscal year 14, but at the rate of $200 million a year, $250 million a year, you're looking at another 3 or 4 years before, if we keep funding the reserve fund, it'll be several years before this would go into effect, and then it would go in at that 20% increment. So it would take another 5 years to fully fund it.
Thank you.
I'm looking at a list of 2010, the list of all the dumps that we had to work on. It was $345,000. So it's probably are not as many as that is producing the funds for. That is all the questions I see right now. Why don't we call up the three groups who asked to speak, and we're within 2 members of a quorum, so I just want to warn the folks who are coming to speak, if you'll hold it to a couple of minutes, we'd be glad to entertain your talk. I have Clint Mueller, Tom Gill, and Mr. Brown. Be glad to have you entertain. Just understand, if 2 people walk out of the room, we're not even going to be able to vote the bill out. So please work with us on that regard, if you will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There's one right there. Okay. Well, I think we picked up one, so, you know. I mean, 14 is our quorum, so, I mean, you know.
I'll be real brief. Clint Mueller.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Clint Mueller, Legislative Director for the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia. I want to personally thank Chairman Hill and Senator Goggins for working with us on this legislation. This is an important piece of legislation for the local governments across the state. We do support this legislation. Be glad to ask any questions, but hopefully, in the sake of time, we won't have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tom Gill with GMA.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Tom Gale with the Georgia Municipal Association. We too endorse this legislation. We know that Chairman Powell, having a local government background, understands that at the local level you can't collect a fee without it reasonably approximating the cost of the regulatory activity or the service you're providing, and we see that as a good model for the state, even though we understand you do need flexibility to shift those dollars around at times. And we think that this is a great approach, and we hope that you'll consider moving it forward.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Mr. Brown.
Good afternoon,
welcome.
Mr. Chairman.
Good to have you, sir.
Members. I'm honored to be here, and obviously I'm the one that's probably screamed the loudest about funding for Joshua's Law. I'm the chairman of the Joshua Brown Foundation, and more importantly, Joshua's father. And this is very personal to me and very important to me. And the reason it is, I don't want you or any other Georgian to have to live in the pain that I have to live in every day. And that's why I do what I do. And by the way, this is what I do. I sold my business, and this is what I do full time. I don't take a salary and I don't take expenses. But I want to thank publicly Mr. Powell for doing this bill. I want to thank you for considering this bill and hope you'll pass it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Okay, I have more questions. Is this Mr. Senator Thompson? That's your...
I was ready to make a motion, Mr. Chairman, if you're ready.
Your motion's in order.
Is it committee substitute?
That's correct. This is committee sub LC 28, 6247 ERS to House Bill 811.
I would move to pass by committee substitute.
I have a second. Other discussion, committee members? All right, all in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you. And all opposed? Do not see an opposed vote. HB 811 passes out by sub. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your attention and being here. Thank you, buddy. Yes, sir. No, I don't care. He might. He'd be good if he would. Well, I would prefer he do it than he do it. But it's your call. We'll put him down, then if he backs up on us, we'll do it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Rick? Oh, really?